Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust here at the News Forum, where all opinions matter. I'm your host, Tony Clement. Obviously not in the studio. We haven't been doing that for a while with the lockdown, but here on my phone in my home recording the show. So thank you for tuning in once again. With me today is the Honorable James Moore, former colleague of mine as a Member of Parliament, and one of my successors as Minister of Industry. We spent nearly 10 years together in the federal cabinet. He has since then become a senior advisor at Edelman, as well as Dentons Canada. James, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tony.
So we're going to start off with maybe not the easiest question, but how are things going in British Columbia with COVID-19? I'm obviously in Ontario, but would love to get your regional perspective.
Well, the data out of British Columbia is actually reasonably good. I mean, the good side of bad. We all see the flattening of the curve. British Columbia, as far as the big provinces go, has actually fared better than the others. And so it puts British Columbia in a unique position of perhaps being the first province to do the consequential lifting of the sort of economic oppression that we're seeing right now. Necessary measures, to be sure, clearly have had a positive impact in terms of fighting the spread of the virality of COVID-19. But I think people are certainly getting in a position now where they're starting to wonder, can we start having some forward progress and movement? Just some data out of British Columbia. There was a deck that was circulated internally by the government of British Columbia that I've seen that showed that out of all of the acute care beds that are in place in the province of British Columbia, right now there are 45% occupancy. So that's very, very good. Right. We've had a total now as of now 69 people have died of COVID. A province of 4.5 million people. That's a pretty remarkably low number relative to the fear that we had anticipated in the beginning. And people are also starting to shift and start thinking about not only the parallel economic consequences of the continued shutdown, but also the parallel health consequences of it. Adrian Dix, the health minister here in British Columbia, who was the former leader of the NDP. He's a very astute politician. And he interestingly sort of put this number out there, I guess, to sort of get it into the ethos, to start getting people, not just those, frankly, who are on the business community or who are on the right, who might sort of instinctively have a more of an eager to open up the economy, but also those who might be sort of more empathetic to the left, where he pointed out that to date, 13,938 elective surgeries have been canceled as a consequence of COVID-19. And elective surgeries include things like hip replacements, knee replacements, scoliosis surgeries, cataract surgeries. There are a lot of people outside of COVID-19, not on an economic basis, but on a health basis, who are suffering and struggling as a consequence of the lockdown as well. And a lot of people I know, as I'm vice chair of the Canadian Cancer Society, a lot of people who are avoiding their mandated cancer treatments and avoiding their therapies because they're scared to go into hospitals because they think it's just a germ bomb and it's going to have so the downstream consequences of the lockdown economically, I think, are known, but the downstream health consequences also need to be increasingly well known so that we can get a mandate from the public and a consent from the public to go forward and start easing the lockdown measures and moving forward. And I think it's
I've always said it's easy to get into lockdown, not so easy to get out of lockdown. And we're sort of in this in-between period right now. And indeed, there's also the social costs of lockdown in terms of drug abuse, domestic violence, and suicide. So I know that this is becoming part of the public discussion now as well.
Well, a very good friend of mine who is a police officer in the Delta Police Department out here in British Columbia, of course, it's a checkerboard patchwork of police detachments. You have the RCMP, but also local police forces. He works for the Delta Police, and he says it's noticeable that the shift that has happened, that a lot more domestic calls, a lot more alcoholism, a lot more teenagers fighting with parents, and it's getting bad and itchy. And when people start seeing those numbers, right, about the number, there are more people, frankly, there are more people who are in acute care in British Columbia as a result of eating disorders than there are right now as a result of COVID. You see in the province of Manitoba, like four people are in ICU right now. You can't destroy an entire economy, you can't ask people to sacrifice everything. So the economic ramp up is going to be challenging. There was an observation I heard from a small business owner on one of the American networks the other day, where he made a very good observation about this. He said, as a small business person, I can survive losing 100% of my customers for 30 to 45 days. What I cannot survive is losing 30% of my customers for the next 24 months.
So tell me about the state of play in British Columbia and your observation as a former industry minister about where we are economically.
Well, in British Columbia specifically, it's gonna hit really really hard. The cruise ship industry for the city of Vancouver is enormously important. The largest employer in the city of Vancouver is the Port of Vancouver, so any traffic moving in and out is going to be screened. YVR, Vancouver International Airport, has been devastated by this. I mean, their movements are going to go to a quarter, I think, of what they expected. The restaurant industry employs 10% of Canadians. We forget that, right? The restaurant. So you think about the industries that are
That's
going to be
huge. Yeah.
that's massive, right? And
Yeah.
so we already know, and you know better than anybody, the shift that we've been having towards automation anyway, AI. This is going to be a massive jolt in that direction in any event. And so you have 10% of Canadians who work in the restaurant industry who are going to be on their back for sure for the next 12 months. Then you start adding in other associated industries, whether it's tourism industry and others. It's going to be incredibly devastating. And I think a lot of businesses, of course, are going to start doing their adjustments and assessing, do we really need the square footage that we have? Can we get away with more telecommuting? Can we do things more digitally? And so the impact certainly on BC's economy is going to be really hard hit. The outside of the Lower Mainland, in the north on the island, which are resource-based largely economies, they're sort of used to boom and bust cycles in the economy because of
Right.
commodity prices, market access, and so on. But this will be a very tough and brutal rude awakening for lower mainlanders who have sort of been devoid of understanding those cycles that have been impacting the rest of the province. And this is going to be a wake-up call for them in terms of understanding that we really can't survive as a province, as a country, of selling lattes to one another and living in downtown Vancouver, that we do actually require substantive structural economic access on a consistent basis. And it's really going to be a massive wake up call.
So you're an advisor at Denton's and Edelman. You've got a national perspective as well. What are you hearing from clients and analysts that you're talking to on a national scale?
Well, I think certainly just broad-based fear. There's the immediate impact, of course, of COVID and the virus and what it means. But I think the government is focused on. They don't say it out loud, but one of the things that they are clearly focused and anxious about is the second wave that's coming. There will be a second wave, and because of the United States, you have states of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, others who are going to open up ahead of others. I mean, some states are still in the lockdown phase; others are opening up, and so you're going to have a checkerboard. And so the recovery from COVID, Donald Trump originally said it was going to be like a V recovery. Others have said it would be more like a U. I think there's an increasing consensus that it's going to be a W. And through that W and that rattle through the economic growth and struggle out of this massive recession, there's going to be an incredible amount of destruction that's going to take place. And so the waves of the second and perhaps third wave before we have broadly accessible, demonstrably effective immunization that's broadly disseminated, that until that happens, we're not going to see a sustained recovery because they're going to be increased hotspots over time. Sorry, go ahead.
No, and that's the thing that hopscotching ahead a little bit. Everybody's looking to the vaccine, which may be 12 to 18 months out, but there's also the production of the vaccine.
Yeah.
And I think you can bet your bottom dollar that if the vaccine is first created in the USA, which is my prediction, I have a hard time believing that Donald Trump is going to produce and export vaccines before every American is immunized. So just because there's a vaccine, and we do have some capacity in Canada, but certainly not enough to deal with the demand.
So before people start assessing the upward long-term curve out, we're still in the curve down, right? And so,
right.
Donald, we had the 30-day closure of the border, which has now been extended to 60 days. He's now, banned immigration for 60 days. I would hope that Dr. Fauci could explain to the president the concept of community spread, but I'll leave my hopes on the sideline. But then on top of that, you're exactly right about the distribution of eventual vaccines. But also, Americans, if they're going to get nationalistic about 3M products,
right?
I promise you, if there's a very tough story on Fox News about people in Nashville having to wait in line and not getting access to fresh, nutritious food, I promise you that Donald Trump will lock down the border, and we'll have some supply chain issues when it comes to food into Canada, perhaps in a constrained time frame. He will absolutely put America first,
Right.
and it'll be hugely problematic. Now, it's not sustainable over the long term because the biggest employer of the American farmers, certainly north of the United States, their biggest customer is actually Canada. Their biggest export market. So, that was among the reasons why we arrived at the USMCA out of the new NAFTA, was the rise of the agriculture community saying, don't cut us off from our largest export market and customers. So, but in the immediate term, there is real anxiety, I know, in the Canadian government about ensuring that we have food security and supply chains locked in, and that Donald Trump doesn't get spooked about that as we go into the fall, because Donald Trump is going to be running on two things, I think, for re-election. One is America First, which could precipitate some of these more aggressive measures, and the second thing, of course, is he's going to run not against Joe Biden, he's going to be running against China.
Right. We see that in his messaging already,
Yeah.
where he's definitely put the blame on the feet of the Chinese government.
Yeah, and it could well be very successful, right? I mean, there's a deep well of resentment towards China for differing reasons. There's a racial component, but I mean, China has done more than enough to earn the scorn of people on the left and the right across the United States and Canada, from cyber espionage and security to intellectual property theft, and those were sins that existed well before COVID-19, and the scandalous approach that China has had when it comes to disclosing this virus, transparency with WHO, and communicating with the rest of the world. It's pretty outrageous, and so Donald Trump clearly sees an opportunity there to escape from his record and his trajectory for re-election, and we'll see if it's successful.
I saw this rodeo when I was Ontario Health Minister during SARS, and it took the Chinese a good 3 months to admit that there was an issue. So unfortunately, that's replayed again. We're speaking with the Honorable James Moore, former colleague of mine, former industry minister, as well as heritage minister, many other titles. Certainly great to have you on the program now. Take us through when you're advising clients, your projections of how we move from the lockdown that we're at right now to a properly functioning economy. How do you see that going?
Well, I think the government has to work with private sector. Private sector really does have to lead on this, and it's going to be a sector by sector approach in terms of gaining back the public's confidence. Sticking with the restaurant industry, which is going to be probably the hardest hit. There's a very good McKinsey study that came out, I think, 2 days ago, over the weekend, about different sectors and how hard they're going to hit. And then they said there's going to be an 80% retraction in spend in the restaurant business for basically the next year. But take that as an example. So I think certainly what that industry has to do is to stand up and put forward their expectations of what their clients and members are going to have to put forward in terms of sanitation standards, retraining of employees, how they're going to treat customers, temperature testing their employees, wiping down menus, maybe going pure digital, transitioning to a better mix where before it was all in-house in restaurant dining, and now it's all pick up and take out, and maybe having a better mix of that, maybe having a different approach to how they're going to do business, and then having those standards be recognized by their industry associations, and having the government then recognize those industry association standards. We always used to have, is this a gold or a LEED standard building for climate responsibility and efficient energy use. I think we're going to have those kinds of things and those kinds of recognitions of best practices in industry because
COVID best practice.
Because the government can lift the cap and businesses can say we're open, but if the public isn't going to come out of their house without wearing latex gloves and face masks, it doesn't really matter what the government says. So there has to be, not only because right now there's business owners, there's this hue and cry of desperation to get things open, to get things moving again, but there's not really a hue and cry from consumers yet to be able to go from eating what they're eating right now at home to going out and eating in a restaurant. Right now it's seen as a want but not a need, right. And it has to transition to that, because increasingly in our society going out to a restaurant was a need. It was a business need, it was a social need, it was a family need. It's kind of what we did. It was a huge part of our culture.
90% of food was consumed outside the home, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this has been a massive shift in all that. But but you would know this as well. I often point to I was in Hong Kong pre-SARS and I was in Hong Kong post-SARS. Very, very different city.
Yeah.
It's a clean city. There's nobody chews gum because you can't spit if you get caught spitting in public, because that was a major part of the early transmission of SARS in Hong Kong. That you got a heavy fine, and you could even go to jail if you're a repeat offender of just spitting in public. And the city was cleaned up, and it was a massively improved city, and the industry moved in, and businesses boomed, and it was a remarkably successful turnaround out of this COVID-19. And it's hard to see some of the daylight out of this, but there are some good things that will come from this, including everybody getting their flu shot, people telling anti-vaxxers to go jump off a bridge, businesses being more sanitary, kids now having a true wake-up call of what a real crisis looks like, not having Wi-Fi access and your TikTok app crashing on you. That's not actually a crisis. This
No.
is a legitimate crisis, and I think there's, this is a once in a century, once in a generation refresh. And there's also been community engagement, and people have become more polite, and people have been more thoughtful, and like there's a sort of a social renewal that's happened as a consequence of this, and a reprioritizing of people in their lives and their affairs that I think is actually a silver lining to all of this. It's a
So
hell
you
of a
see,
hell of a lot of destruction to go through to get to some of that silver lining, but there are silver linings.
exactly. Yeah. No, that's we've got to look for it where we can. So you're predicting a cultural change that is engendered by the COVID afterwards that you saw and observed in Hong Kong on one level. How does it change the economics of the office space? We've got a lot of people, teleworking right now, uh, presuming that some form of physical slash social distancing will be required for months ahead. How does the office work in this situation?
Well, so you've introduced me as my two main gigs that I'm engaged in right now with Dentons and Edelman. So Edelman is a public affairs, public relations, and an ad agency, the largest in the world, based out of Chicago. And their office spaces around the world, they're all open concept, and so there's that open shared environment and all that. And I wonder, and it's not, I think, been determined whether or not that's going to be rethought, because this idea of sort of mutual accountability through an open space and not hiding in your offices and googling around all day and wasting time, is seen to have been an effective model for Edelman. But as a consequence of this, you wonder whether or not people are going to be productive and comfortable in that environment on a go forward basis. So I think there's going to be some rethink. On the other side, at Dentons, it's a law firm, and so everybody has their own offices, and they're all soundproofed because of confidentiality, and everybody works sort of in very isolated spaces. You go into a law firm, and it's dead quiet because people are just reading all day, and then of course you're doing client calls as well, which have to be, again, confidential. So it's a very, very quiet and isolated space. And which model is better over time, I don't know. It depends on the business, but I certainly know that in my universe, I'm getting very literate in telecommuting and digital interfacing with clients and with the world. I mean, I'm effectively going to be building a proper full 1080p, 60 frames per second home studio, properly mic'd, properly lit, properly cameraed, with a still camera and all that, so that I can engage with clients all over the place and through a digital interface. Because it's that's just the way of the future. Ron Ambrose and I were talking about that the other day. Like I've got proper lenses and microphones and stands and everything else. So I've gone deep into the world of technology when it comes to effective live streaming. This isn't it, by the way, so don't judge me on this skew.
No, 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 no,
But
no, no.
but it's just it's going to be the way of the future, and I think people are going to become very economic with their time. It's going to
Right.
matter more what you do, not how long you do it. What you accomplish, not where you accomplish it, and just delivering results. And so people are going to be very I think circumscribed in their and shifting in their expectations of how people deliver on results for their firms.
Well, one thing for sure, we're not going to want to go back to the long commutes that a lot of people had to deal with,
Yeah.
in the major cities. So that's something that people have not missed at all.
Well, and that's one of the things. I mean, not that we're great at building public transit on any kind of a timely basis. However, I typically take public transit into work into Vancouver on the West Coast Express, and it is a confined space. It would run 90 degrees to what every chief public health officer in Canada says that we should do. Social distancing will not work just because the nature of the travel and all that. And so there's this effort to say, one of the pillars of economic recovery for the government to look into, of course, is to dump more money into infrastructure. The old chestnut that infrastructure spend saves all. So they could put more money into infrastructure, and if it's public infrastructure, you're actually going to be putting a longer term burden onto municipalities and regional governments because the cost of sustaining that infrastructure is not going to be met if more people are going to be telecommuting and less people are going to be out. There's already a per rider subsidy that is
That's right.
effectively mandated in British Columbia through property taxes and through the provincial government, because the per rider cost is not covered entirely by the fare, and the gaps are different depending on where you are. Well, those gaps are going to grow. And you look at TransLink, which is the regional transportation authority here in the Lower Mainland, enormously successful, very well led organization. But they're seeing empty trains and empty carriages and all that stuff. And so if we're going to build more and more infrastructure and fewer people are going to ride it, you're actually putting a longer term burden onto lower levels of government in terms of maintaining that infrastructure. So it's these are among the things that are going to have to be assessed going forward.
A lot of rethinks, public transit, office space. I would say hospitals, again, we got to rethink. We had a rethink after SARS, but we'll have another rethink with COVID. And social norms. You're quite right, James, more that those are going to be up for grabs, I believe, as well. So
Yeah, I don't know if
lots.
I don't know if I'm not going to miss the kiss on the cheek hello. I won't really miss the hug hello. I might miss the handshake hello because it
Yeah,
was kind of a reaffirming thing or whatever. I think it's the Dutch who do the three kisses, French do
right.
two, and sort of North American French do one cheek or whatever. But it's those gone. That's
Yeah,
gone.
yeah.
Yeah,
I think we're all going to be the namaste, approach to
exactly.
things. Maybe Vancouver will be ahead of the curve on that.
Yeah,
We've been
perhaps.
speaking with James Moore here on Boom and Bust, the Honorable James Moore, former cabinet minister in the Canadian government, the federal government, and now senior advisor to Edelman as well as Denton's. James Moore, thank you for being on Boom and Bust. We hope to have you back in the future.
My pleasure. Thank you, Tony.